Empress Josephine is one of history's great enigmas. She went from outsider to one of the most powerful women in the nation. But was she a cunning genius or a simple pawn in a Game of Thrones? In recent years, historians have noticed that every portrait of Empress Josephine contains an utterly heartbreaking detail. Empress Josephine never smiles with her teeth exposed, and we now know that she did it for a very dark reason. There are few love stories as passionate or as twisted as the one between Napoleon Bonaparte and Josephine. Napoleon was as easily obsessed with her as he was with his tenuous grip on the French crown. But when it comes to Josephine, the drama began long before her relationship with him, and it didn't stop after they separated. In fact, Napoleon is really just one chapter in her roller coaster of a story. Though the history books often refer to her as Empress Josephine or Josephine de Beauharnais, Josephine was only a name she took around the time she met Napoleon. Marie-Joseph Teicher de la Pagerie really just went by Rose most of the time. And much like her name, Josephine ended up very, very far from where she started. Josephine was born thousands of miles away from the kingdom she would eventually come to rule over, on the island of Martinique in the West Indies. The family business was a sugarcane plantation that used slave labor. Though they made a fortune from their business, you could say that they certainly ended up paying a karmic price. A series of hurricanes had damaged their property and they were struggling. Josephine's education suffered as a result of her family's troubles, and as the eldest daughter of the family hit her teens, aka marrying age, the pressure was on for her to find a wealthy husband who might overlook their family's inability to pay a dowry. Joseph Caspert's sister Marie popped up and presented her brother with what she saw as the opportunity of a lifetime. She was the mistress to a rich naval officer, whose youngest son, Alexandre, was an eligible bachelor. Though Josephine was the eldest daughter, Alexandre passed her over, and the reason why was brutal. At just 17, Alexandre de Beauharnais initially deemed 15-year-old Josephine too old, redirecting his attention to her 13-year-old sister, Catherine. However, tragedy struck when Catherine suddenly died. That left one last option: Josephine. This was certainly not the fairy tale romance that a young girl dreams of, but she had no other choice. In 1779, she left her home to marry Alexandre, a self-appointed viscount. Despite his wealth on paper, Alexandre proved to be a terror, alienating Josephine from French society. He viewed their relationship as a means to secure his family fortune, and was harboring a desire for an already married woman by the name of Marie de Longpre. Josephine, facing societal challenges and her husband's questionable behavior, persevered, eventually giving birth to their son Eugene in 1781. Unfortunately, her hope that motherhood would improve their relationship was in vain. Despite their similar backgrounds, Alexandre's disdain for Josephine reached new heights. When she was pregnant with their second child, Hortense, he abandoned her to travel to Martinique with Madame de Longpre. Upon Hortense's premature birth in 1783, he audaciously questioned the child's parentage. Despite societal norms against divorce, Josephine made a bold move to escape Alexandre's tumultuous presence. Considering the nightmare end of that union, it's a miracle that Josephine tied the knot ever again. Josephine and the kids took up residence at the Pentamont Abbey in Paris, which happened to be a lucky choice. It was a popular spot for aristocratic types, and she learned how to better fit in high society from them. Soon, she and the kids moved in with her aunt. Alexandre was still refusing to pay her, but luckily, staying with her aunt meant housing was covered. Unfortunately, Josephine had picked up some expensive habits. Josephine was getting over an ugly breakup with a man who treated her poorly. Her choice of therapy was of the retail variety. There was just one problem. With no money coming in, she was putting it all on credit. As the walls seemed to close in, Josephine started to put what she'd learned at the Abbey to use. She began rubbing elbows with those in the king's retinue, but she wasn't just hoping that they had financial advice for her. Though divorce did not seem to be in the cards for Josephine, she didn't consider herself completely out of the hunting for a rich husband game. As she integrated herself into the king's posse, Josephine would research her romantic options, or rather, the thickness of their wallets. After all, she couldn't quite rebound yet, but there were plenty of men who were all too happy to help her out with gifts and money. Josephine didn't know it yet, but the chance for new romance wasn't as far out of reach as she thought. Josephine returned to Martinique in 1788, and her timing was both terrible and fortuitous. Though she did end up in the middle of a slave rebellion back home, She also missed a whole lot of action in France, as in the beginning of the French Revolution. Though they'd had some proximity to the royal family, Josephine's ex Alexandre had done enough smack-talking about the king that neither he nor Josephine were in immediate danger, at least at first. The unrest reached a fever pitch, and people began turning on each other. It was the reign of terror. Josephine did her best to fly under the radar, getting her children apprenticeships in trades and claiming to be American. Of course, this fooled no one. Alexandre was the first to fall. Revolutionaries detained him, citing his poor work during the French Revolutionary War. Of course, it was his aristocratic roots that were the real problem. After the arrest of Alexandre in March 1794, Josephine met a terrifying fate herself. Like her doomed husband, she too was detained and imprisoned by French revolutionaries. Even though she and Alexandre were already separated, the rebels jailed Josephine because she was still financially tied to Alexandre. Once again, her awful first husband had led Josephine into a brutal situation. The exes both ended up in Les Carmes prison, where they became living proof that old habits die hard. Alexandre soon found a mistress, but this time, Josephine met a lover of her own. She also made friends and, if you can believe it, received letters from her children by way of her very well-trained pug. They'd sneak notes under his collar and was tiny enough to slip through the gates of Les Carmes. Unfortunately, the ruse was short-lived. It wasn't all fun and games. Les Carmes was generally a filthy, miserable place. When the guards discovered the letters, they cut off Josephine's communications. Ultimately, she spent 100 days in Les Carmes, and when she got out, the world was an entirely different place. Josephine had pretty much been the next on the butcher's block when the reign of terror came to its abrupt end, saving her hide. Unfortunately, her husband didn't have the same luck. Alexandre was executed just days before Josephine was released, his sentence for treason. Josephine finally had the freedom she never thought she'd get. Josephine made the most of her time as a single lady and enjoyed flirting with hot-ticket bachelors at events for survivors and even a victims ball. It was at an event hosted by Teresa, a fellow Les Carmes survivor, where she met Paul Barras. The two soon became lovers, but they hid some twisted secrets behind bedroom doors. According to rumors, Josephine didn't just have an intimate time with Barras. Apparently, the rebellious couple also invited Teresa and her new husband, Jean-Lambert Tallien, who initiated the end to the reign of terror, into their bed as well. Hey, who can blame them? They had a lot to celebrate. Of course, that wasn't the only trouble this band of merry fools got into. When he wasn't busy drinking and partying, Paul Barras was a canny politician who just happened to befriend a young commander named Napoleon Bonaparte. Barras saw the makings of a real leader in Napoleon, and he also saw the potential to manipulate the occasionally moody and disaffected young man. So he used what he had at his disposal. Napoleon may have been adept to leading his men, but this didn't really translate into charming the ladies. They rebuffed his every advance, and he did not take it well. Barras knew exactly what to do. He introduced Napoleon to Josephine, who actually gave him the time of day for once, and maybe even laid on the charm at her lover's behest. Well, after a lifetime of rejection, it didn't take much for Napoleon to fall hard. Napoleon began to go after Josephine full force. At the time, of course, Josephine was in a friends with benefits situation with Barras, but she played a different game with Napoleon. After all, she was at something of a disadvantage. Not only was she a widow with 2 kids, she was also 6 years older than him. When they began to spend more time together, the age gap made jaws drop. The first, but not the last, scandal that their romance caused. Napoleon pursued Josephine ardently, showering her with attention and writing her a prolific amount of love letters. But this passion had a dark side. Josephine wrote that his intensity could be off-putting and that he had a terrifying penchant for jealousy. But for all his flaws, Josephine had to consider his proposal seriously. As you may have guessed, Josephine eventually accepted his proposal, and they planned a wedding for March of 1796. During their engagement, Napoleon's wild passion for Josephine only intensified, but he remained an unpredictable figure. Even on their wedding day, Napoleon's mixed signals went all out. He showed up 2 hours late for the ceremony, only to give his bride an inscribed ring that read, "Au destin," to destiny. Napoleon adored Josephine, and Josephine absolutely adored her pet dog, Fortune. Fortune had famously been the one to help her kids smuggle in letters when she was behind bars. Well, Napoleon learned on his wedding night that he was going to have to vie for his new wife's affection. Fortune not only slept in the very same bed as Napoleon and Josephine on their wedding night, he also bit Napoleon in the leg. Napoleon's family was horrified at his choice of bride, from the fact that she was a widow with 2 kids to the age gap, which they fudged the numbers to cover on their wedding day. There was nothing they could do about it once the couple had sealed the deal, but that didn't stop them from doing their best to make Josephine feel unwelcome. Napoleon's mother and sister had heard all about Josephine's rumored alliances with Barras and Tallien, and they were not impressed with her new in-law. As a result, Napoleon's sister Pauline took great pains to humiliate her new sister-in-law. She'd commission extravagant dresses to outdo Josephine at balls and calling her the old lady. Though Josephine tried to win Napoleon's family over, they never fully accepted her. Even so, all the family drama in the world could only pale in comparison to Josephine's later scandals. Napoleon and Josephine had precious little time together after the wedding, and he left for a campaign just days after the ceremony. Once again, his dark side reared its ugly head, and his letters to Josephine vacillate between declarations of devotion, disappointment, and jealousy. But then again, maybe he had a good reason not to trust her. The ink was barely dry on the marriage papers when Josephine began an affair with an officer named Hippolyte Charles. After all, this type of casual relationship was exactly what she was used to. She didn't know she was making a horrible mistake. If Josephine thought she could get away with it, especially with the scrutiny of Napoleon's family and high society focused on her, she was terribly wrong. Infidelity was almost run-of-the-mill in Josephine's circles. When the rumors reached Napoleon, things reached a fever pitch. One of Napoleon's letters to his brother, where he complained about Josephine's affair with Hippolyte Charles, leaked to the press. Now everyone knew their marriage is in deep trouble and at a very crucial point in Napoleon's career. Though they stayed together, the betrayal took a dark toll on him, and the relationship was never the same again. He also got revenge in his own way, taking up with a series of mistresses. In a matter of months, Napoleon's obsession with Josephine waned. All of a sudden, their relationship had far more in common with her first marriage than she liked. In December 1800, Napoleon and Josephine set out to see one of Haydn's operas in Paris. It should have been a lovely night out, but instead it turned into a horrific nightmare. A bomb was secretly planted underneath a parked car near the opera house. The plot of the Rue Saint-Nicaise was supposed to end Napoleon's life, and it certainly would have, had it not been for Josephine. Josephine insisted on delaying the party so she could drape her silk shawl just right. At the time, Napoleon was annoyed with his bride's demands, but her fastidiousness ended up saving his life. The device went off too late to hurt Napoleon, whose carriage had already passed. The same, sadly, could not have been said for many of the bystanders who were injured or lost their lives in the blast. Though there was certainly more disdain in the relationship than before, there was still something of a push-pull between Josephine and Napoleon. But that wasn't the only pressure in the relationship. As Napoleon's career progressed, it became clear that he needed an heir. Josephine was 32 when they got married, but she hadn't got pregnant yet, and not for lack of trying. It was clear that other factors were at play. Despite her many other affairs, Josephine had never had to deal with an unplanned pregnancy. In those days, particularly strong feminine hygiene products were used as a sort of plan B, if you catch my drift. It looked like Josephine was paying a cruel price for sowing her wild oats. It's possible that these treatments, along with the poor condition she suffered at Les Carmes, had left her infertile. Sadly, the worst was yet to come. Josephine headed to a spa town in hopes that a little R&R would help her chances of getting pregnant. Instead, a brutal accident made things worse when a balcony she was standing on collapsed, leaving her injured. As the likelihood increased that Napoleon would become ruler of France, they knew that they would have to face the truth about the necessity of an heir eventually. They just weren't ready yet. In the absence of a pregnancy, Josephine focused on the children she already had. Hortense, her daughter by her first husband, was old enough to get married, but the choice they made for a husband was truly twisted. She ended up tying the knot with Napoleon's brother, Louis. Yep, mother and daughter could go on double dates with their husband's brothers. Despite their many problems, Josephine played a pivotal role in Napoleon's political career, glad-handing things for her notoriously charmless husband behind the scenes. When Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French at the hands of Pope Pius VII in 1804, he officially had Josephine proclaimed Empress as well. Talk about marrying up! The coronation ceremony was almost ruined. However, as Empress Josephine had walked in on a terrible sight, she saw her husband Napoleon visiting her lady-in-waiting, Elizabeth de Vaudey, in her bedroom. This led to such a serious spat that in the end, their little daughter Hortense had to step in and smooth things over so that the coronation could go on. Now that he was finally emperor, Napoleon had even more cruelty in store for his wife. He repeatedly threatened Empress Josephine with divorce because he believed that she couldn't give him one crucial thing: a male heir. The already disintegrating marriage would crumble in 1807 when a massive tragedy rocked the Bonaparte family. Napoleon's heir presumptive, his nephew Napoleon Charles, tragically perished of croup, leaving the emperor without any successor. That's when Napoleon made a brutal choice. He needed an heir, and to get that, he needed a new wife. On December 14, 1809, Napoleon made history by divorcing his great love, Empress Josephine. When Napoleon told Empress Josephine that he planned on divorcing her, her reaction was disturbing. The devastated wife immediately fell to the palace floors. She was literally paralyzed by shock, forcing Napoleon to carry her into her bedroom so that she could recover in privacy. But even in her chambers, Josephine couldn't hide her pain. Her wails echoed throughout the Tuileries. Napoleon and Josephine's breakup was completely scandalous, and their chilling divorce ceremony didn't make things any more palatable. Even though the breakup had to happen, the couple was so distraught that they read statements of devotion aloud to each other as they signed the divorce paperwork. Josephine was so distraught that she couldn't finish her statement and needed someone else to step in on her behalf. But the mixed signals only got murkier. To prove that he was only remarrying to produce a legitimate heir, Napoleon said something so disturbing that it's impossible to forget. He claimed his next wedding would be to a womb. Let's hope Napoleon didn't tell his second wife, the Archduchess Mary Louise of Austria, about that ice-cold disclaimer. Over the course of Napoleon and Josephine's divorce, the couple's dirty laundry aired out in the most public way. It turned out that their original wedding was full of lies, letting Napoleon claim that the marriage itself didn't count. The person who wed Napoleon and Josephine wasn't officially allowed to do so. Josephine lied on the paperwork by claiming to be significantly younger than she really was. Napoleon himself wrote down a fake birthday and address. After their divorce, Napoleon was still smitten with his ex. He even allowed Josephine to retain the title of Empress of the French. In his own words, "It is my will that she retain the rank and title of Empress, and especially that she never doubt my sentiments, and that she ever hold me as her best and dearest friend." It really seemed as though Napoleon was more obsessed with Empress Josephine than ever. Josephine was the original material girl. She loved gems and jewels so much that when Napoleon needed to make nice with his wife, he'd give her lavish jewelry. His grandest gift came just before the couple's divorce, when he bestowed extravagant emerald jewelry on his soon-to-be ex. Thrilled, Josephine hired an artist to paint her in the beautiful green gems. She didn't know it at the time, but this was a huge mistake. After Napoleon and Josephine split, the new divorcee lived in the country, away from the spotlight, or so it seemed. Josephine's name quickly re-entered the newspaper when she claimed that her precious emerald jewelry had been stolen. Napoleon tried desperately to retrieve the jewels, but not for chivalry. Instead, he had far darker reasons to get the emeralds back to their owner. Then, as now, when a major couple breaks up, people take sides. When it came to the split between Josephine and Napoleon, France was firmly for the abandoned empress. Napoleon worried that his enemies would use the jewel theft as an excuse to make up dark stories that he'd planned the heist. He was desperate to stop the bad press in its tracks, but Napoleon's men simply couldn't find the culprit. With no other option available, Napoleon hired the infamous thief François-Eugène Vidocq. In a wild twist, Vidocq managed to do what no one else could. He tracked down not only the empress's stolen emeralds, but the men who took them and the people who bought them. Using this success as leverage, Vidocq got the emperor to pardon his crimes and even turn this ex-criminal mastermind into an official police officer. Some historians believe that the true culprit behind the jewel heist wasn't a regular con man. Instead, they suspect a far more disturbing option: Empress Josephine herself. Certain scholars think the empress could have orchestrated the whole scheme to turn the public against her ex Napoleon. If so, Josephine was utterly diabolical. Though Napoleon finally got the heir he so desired with his new wife, he continued to hold a torch for Josephine. They were on friendly terms until his exile, and Josephine had to make a heartbreaking choice. Tsar Alexander I, who'd humiliated her ex in the defeat that led to his exile, wanted to visit her at home in Malmaison. She knew that her future hung in the balance, and that she could pay a brutal price for displaying any loyalty to Napoleon. Only, this was a lose-lose situation. Empress Josephine received Alexander as a visitor, But while they were out walking one day, she caught a chill. Soon, she was fighting for her life. Within 2 weeks, she was dead at just 50 years old. After learning of Josephine's tragic fate, her ex-husband Napoleon responded with a heartbreaking gesture. Mad with grief, he locked himself in a room for 2 full days and refused to see anyone. Before Josephine passed on, Napoleon brought a strange guest to visit his ex-wife on her deathbed, his child and legitimate heir, Napoleon II, from his second marriage. Apparently, he brought the little boy to visit Josephine so she could meet the child who had caused her so many tears. Thanks? When you look back at the evidence of the passion Napoleon had for Empress Josephine, his obsession was undeniable, but there was a strange twist to the relationship. Though she definitely showed she loved him in her own way, Josephine was something of a cold fish. While he would write his wife elaborate love letters about the intoxicating pleasures she gave him, Josephine was known to rarely even read Napoleon's missives. When he cooed over a portrait of his bride and constantly kept it safe in his pocket, apparently Empress Josephine never bothered to look at paintings of her husband. Many of these letters still exist today in all their romantic glory, though reading through them now may make Napoleon seem like a weirdo. In one of his passionate letters to Empress Josephine, he refers to her nether regions as the Little Black Forest. In another tale, he wrote to her that he'd be home from a campaign in 3 days, requesting that she not wash before then. Alright. Napoleon often dictated his letters to secretaries. However, he wrote letters to his lovers by hand. As we've seen, these letters were pretty legendary, but it turns out his efforts were pretty much futile. Empress Josephine simply could not understand much of what her beau wrote. When people asked her about Napoleon's well-being, she would resort to saying that Napoleon was fine. Ouch. Napoleon came to understand how much he'd loved Empress Josephine only later in his life, or to be exact, at the very end of his life. On his deathbed, Empress Josephine appeared in her ex's final words. As Napoleon perished, he said, "France, l'armée, tête d'armée." France, the army, the head of the army, Josephine. In recent years, historians noticed that every portrait of Empress Josephine contains an utterly heartbreaking detail. Empress Josephine never shows her teeth when she smiles, and we now know that she did it for a dark reason. Josephine's teeth were pitch black due to cavities and decay. She hid them for her entire life, teaching herself to laugh with her mouth closed and speaking behind her handkerchief when she entered the public eye. And there you have it, the captivating journey through the life of Empress Josephine, a woman whose story unfolds like the most riveting of historical dramas. From her humble beginnings to the dazzling heights of imperial power, Josephine's life was a tapestry woven with love, ambition, and intrigues of an era gone by. If you've enjoyed these stories, don't forget to show some love by hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Stay tuned because we'll be back with more incredible narratives soon. Thanks for joining us today, and until next time.